Hello, my fellow English teacher friends. So I am super excited to do this writing workshop. So this is an absolute gem for rhetorical analysis. Usually, the pieces that I select tend to be rather pedantic and academic. And this one, even though it's got this air of levity to it, is actually pretty complex. And I think once students hunker into the finer nuance of the piece, they'll realize that Marge Simpson gave Barbara Bush a bit of a curveball with this one. So it's pretty pithy. So let's dive right in. And as always, I'll preface things by saying this. So those of you that are familiar with my work, you'll see that I'll be incorporating the same templates as always. So we'll tackle the introductory paragraph with either the declarative or the inverted thesis. And then the body paragraphs, we will bust out the syllogistic method. So that's the glory of these templates, is that totally demystifies the writing process for our students. New essay, same old approach. I find it kind of ironic and it's kind of sad, like when I walk into a classroom, say of seniors, and teacher passes out an essay and says, on your mark, get set, go. And the students sit there and look at their blank sheet of paper or their, Chromebook screens as if they don't know what to do. And I think that's a phenomena that a lot of teachers experience. And it's like, oh my goodness, man, it's like May. We've been together all academic year. What do you mean you don't know what to do? And part of that is, you need templates, and you also need to do a decent job Bob Rossing your instruction, which is my next slide. So by Bob Rossing your instruction, here's what I mean by this. So I think Bob Ross was one of the greatest teachers of all time, because he'd come onto the screen and say something closely akin to, hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge. There's a fundamental difference between the assigning of something and the direct, explicit teaching of it. And Bob would get there at the easel, with his canvas, with his paints and his brushes, and he would proceed to demonstrate for us how to approximate those directions on a canvas. And even if we are inept at painting, we can pick up our brushes and closely approximate what Bob is doing. Over time, if we practice and practice and practice with him, we'll become pretty good painters. And here's the kicker. Bob Ross and I are similar in the sense that every single time he painted, he used a heuristic, or call it a template if you want, called the wet on wet technique. And for my compositions, no matter the expository mode, it's declare, invert, syllogistic every single time. So let's jump right in. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And again, for those of you that, I'm old hat at this time, you've seen my routine, you've heard my spiel. I hope you say to yourselves, oh my God, this guy's repetitive. Yes, that's the thing. So I love it when students start slumping in their desks saying, oh my God, Kuhn, shut up. You say the same thing every time. Because then they know how to tackle the essay, and they don't need me to Bob Ross my instruction anymore. They can intuitively, instinctually, habitually just crank it out, and that's what we want. That's the value of a template. So we can declare or invert the thesis. And ultimately, let me go back. Ultimately, for a declarative thesis, here's what you do. You begin by dropping the thesis in the first sentence. Just out of the gate, boom, drop the thesis. Then there's some things that I look for in there. So I like to go for voice, rhythm, and flow points right out of the gate. So you'll see my students do a fairly decent job of manipulating their syntax. They are very well versed in Strunk and White's Write It Right, And in that book, those two authors suggest that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. And I skill and drill my students a lot until they master that. So you'll see some really good sentence constructs out of my students. I also have a word study academy that I run all year with my students. So you'll see what I call tier 2 level vocabulary, which is just basically your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. And in addition to that, my template for the introduction necessitates that the students write 4 sentences for the introductory paragraph. No more, no less, exactly 4 sentences. The only difference for the inverted thesis is that you end with the thesis. So you begin with context, background, and as you funnel it down towards that 4th sentence, you drop the thesis. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples in just a second. But here's the kicker. And I say this every time I do literary analysis as well. Nothing changes for rhetorical analysis. Implicit in every prompt, and this is especially true of the AP Lang exam, there are 2 questions in every prompt. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So for literary analysis, I demonstrated, and you can go back and watch some videos on that. For literary analysis, you always want to invert your thesis. And for rhetorical analysis, you always want to declare your thesis. So here's the kicker with this. I tell my students that they have to locate the 3 most seminal, salient, important terms or devices. So the 3 most important moves that the author makes or the orator makes, and situate the thesis around those terms or devices. So in essence, you're getting to the construction of meaning first. In literary analysis, and again, I encourage you to go back and look at some videos on this. In literary analysis, you end with that question. How does the author construct meaning? And in rhetorical analysis, you begin by answering that question and then follow through with the authorial intent. So it's just flipped. It's just an inverted process from literary analysis. So as we read with my students, when we go over text and do our discussions, like our Plato discussion, we have a poster in my room that looks very much like this. And the students add words to it, terms and devices to it as the academic year progresses. And I say something to them all the time. I say pattern, 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 pattern. When we read, even though we have a new passage or a new piece, the same terms and devices keep appearing over and over and over again, right? So we don't have to reinvent, the wheel every time we read a passage, right? So we know that tone is a driving force, and we have to pay attention to ethos, pathos, logos, syntax, tone, and diction, and that sometimes there are litanies, and sometimes there's enumeration and anaphora, and that we have things like juxtapositions that we have to pay attention to, and connotative and denotative and literal and figurative meanings. And again, new passage, have your antennae up for those things that repeat over and over again in passages. So as we read, we try to identify the 3 most salient terms that are going to be in the introductory paragraph, sandwiching the thesis statement. We do, here's the thing with templates, the writing takes care of itself after a while. They don't really need me to model. They don't need me to Bob Ross. They get it. They know how to structure their writing. What my students struggle with the most is ascertaining deep, accurate ascertainments of the author's intent. So we do a lot of small passages over and over and over again just to become better readers. So let's take a look at a few introductions to see how this template works. So out of the gate, I tell my students, lead with the most important term or device. So like what anchors this piece in terms of the construction of meaning? So I wrote all of these, by the way. So, I always tell teachers when I work with them, position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom. So to model how to construct these introductions, I wrote 3 for the students, and I'm just going to talk my way through it. And then I say, on your mark, get set, go. And typically what I do so that they're not, being mockingbirds, I'll model text A, and I'll say, you cannot write about text A, but since we're using a template, just follow my lead and you're writing about text B. All right, so just so that there's not a lot of stealing and mimicry going on. So for this one, look how I tackle this. Strictly adhering to the formal structure of someone far beyond committing highfalutin errors, Marge counters the First Lady's criticism by being overly proper and dignified. So I'm contending that the most important thing in here is the formality of the letter, right? It's written by somebody who's just expert on letter writing. The template used, the formalism of it. I think that characteristic is really big. So I got 1 out of the 3 out of the way. So look how I proceed. At times sarcastic and bantering, so I got the tone. The response gently mocks the fact that the president's wife is taking issue with a mere cartoon, something rather trite and insignificant given the importance of Oval Office duties. Marge, quite cunningly, flips the script and actually calls into question the First Lady's ethos. So that's my 3rd, as well as her husband's. Juxtaposing the dumbness of a cartoon targeting an adult audience to the dumbness of affairs in D.C., Marge implores Mrs. Bush to really consider which of the 2 is more inane. So what is the author's intent? How does the author construct meaning? So there's a focus on the 3 most salient terms and or devices. Look at the sentence constructs. Look at the tier 2 level vocabulary and note that it's always going to be 4 sentences long. That's the template. That's how you manipulate it for rhetorical analysis. And again, early in the academic year, probably even in the middle of the academic year, you gotta Bob Ross this. So you just can't talk in the ether about this and expect your students to execute it. You are the expert writer in the classroom. Show them how to do it. And when I model introductions, I usually say, I did it 3 times. And then for the syllogistic body paragraphs, I do it 2 times, so that they have a clear sense of how to tackle things. So here's my second introduction. It's going to follow the exact same template, just write it differently. So in this case, I'm going to contend that the tone is the most important aspect of this piece. And when my students identify tone, I tell them not to interact with tone as if it's this monolithic thing. I think in order to fully ascertain a tone, you need to use 2 tone words. And I tell my students 1 should be a tier 2 level word, just so that you're really getting anchored in that academic voice. So look what I have here. With a rather wry and mock formal tone, Marge addresses the First Lady's criticism of the Simpsons and puts the president's wife in her place. So start with tone, and then we got 3 sentences, 2 more terms, devices. Giving off the appearance that she is an experienced letter writer, Marge cops to certain errors in order to counter the original remarks made against her and her family. So I got to the form of the piece. Through a subtle and forthright sarcasm, so now we're there, Marge turns the table and actually questions the character of the nation's most preeminent family. Citing the show for being overly dumb, Marge implores the president's wife to take a good hard look at her surroundings in order to reassess her initial read of an innocuous cartoon program. Always 4 sentences. Focus on that voice rhythm and flow through the vocab and the sentence constructs. What is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? And here's the cool thing. This is the exact same thing that students are doing in every genre for literary analysis. It's just that there you're inverting and here we are declaring. So again, the beauty is that using templates really demystifies the writing process. to the point where, students aren't second guessing themselves. They're not looking at their blank sheet of paper saying, oh, what do I do? What's the teacher want? What's the demand of the assignment? They can just like jump right in and crank these suckers out, which is really good, especially if we're teaching this for our AP Lang students who have, 3 essays to write under grueling time constraints. And here's the last one, right? How does the author construct meaning? What is the authorial intent? 4 sentences, sentence constructs, tier 2, sprinkle in that context and background. Rather tongue-in-cheek, Marge counters the First Lady's remarks with a formal, albeit sarcastic tone. So identify 2 tones. Embracing the persona of someone well-versed in how to write in the style of high society, Marge goes toe-to-toe with Mrs. Bush and actually implores the First Lady to take a good hard look at herself and her husband. In defense to the criticism, Marge throws a few zingers of her own to bring the president's wife back down to size. In juxtaposing a mere cartoon to the solemn nature of governing a country, Marge pokes Barbara in the ribs and offers her own bit of subtle sarcasm. So one of the things that I wanted to talk to my students about was, in argument, persuasion, and synthesis, I often teach and coach my students to, at times, sprinkle in a little bit of vernacular and colloquial, just for pizzazz, just for that wow factor. If they can cop a really good academic tone and also cop that colloquial flair, I think it adds to their voice point. And typically in rhetorical analysis, that is probably like the most formal of the expository modes. You typically don't do that. But when you've got a glib, kind of sarcastic, humorous, tongue-in-cheek piece like this letter from Marge Simpson to Barbara Bush, I think it's safe to use a little bit of the vernacular, like zinger, and I said pokes Barbara in the ribs, and just things of that nature. Marge goes toe to toe. So I'm just modeling for my students that given the text, given the levity of the text, really determines the level to which you can bust out the vernacular and the colloquial. And I think it's fair game in this one. So just demonstrating for them that they can do that to a certain extent. They have to keep in mind that it is nonetheless a very academic paper. So the next question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do I write the body paragraphs? And again, some of you are familiar with my work and some of you are not. So for those that are not, I'm going to give a brief encapsulation of the syllogistic method. And for those of you that are familiar with this, you can just fast forward. So the syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about oration, polemics, debate. And oftentimes they would just kind of sit around in a circle, and one of the teachers would say, all right, today we're going to debate the following essential question. What is justice? And for those of you that are familiar, that's the whole nature of Plato's Republic, that essential question, what is justice? So, one philosophical thinker comes to the mic and says, here's my definition of justice. And then the others huddle around and they find the bullet holes in the logic and they debunk it and say, that will not do. We need a better definition of justice. So the next think tanker comes up to the mic and offers his definition of justice, and it just goes on and on and on. And at the end of Plato's Republic, nobody comes up with a clear definition of justice. But each definition is a syllogism. And this is how Aristotle taught his students to argue. So it's when you are cogent and have a clear line of reasoning in which you argue from premise to conclusion. So here's a simple example. If I say in my first premise, arsenic is deadly. Second premise, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. That's supreme cogency right there. That's utterly logical, right? Very mathematical in its computation. And when our students write, we want them to be that locked in. One of the buzzwords within the last, or buzz phrases within the last 5 years or so, is line of reasoning. And this template really ensures, if it's executed correctly, that the student has a line of reasoning. And that's half the battle. So here's what the syllogistic method looks like as a template for the purposes of performing rhetorical analysis. The first premise is going to be an argument containing terms and devices. So that big list that I had a few slides ago, any of those come into play. The second premise is always static. It's textual support. And in this case, I tell my students, teeter-totter balance your quoting and paraphrasing. And again, this should look very similar to literary analysis for those of you that have gone on that journey with me. It's the exact same thing. You're instead of literary terms, you're using rhetorical terms. And then the conclusion, and I want to be mindful of this because sometimes I confuse teachers and students with this. The conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay. So the body paragraph has a conclusion, and that's going to be comprised of your textual analysis. And basically, the first premise is a promise. And I always tell my students, make sure you're shaking hands, make sure you're keeping your promise, echo the thesis, and link it back to the thesis. And students ask this question. It's a very, very insightful question. They say, all right, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. You want the introduction to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. Therefore, you must have a number of sentences that you're looking for the syllogistic body paragraph. And I say, I do. Good question. So those little itty bitty 4, 5, 6 sentence body paragraphs that we're so accustomed to seeing and getting from our students, there's just not enough support and analysis in there to fully advance an argument. So I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, hard cap at 12. And in that way, they can have a nice, complex, full-bodied first premise and really have at it, really have a full, substantial argument with plenty of support and analysis. So let's jump right in. So students are always asking really good questions. And one thing that I advise them to do when they stare at their blank sheet of paper or their blank screens and they say, I don't know what to do. I say, have a sequence, have a chronology, always have line of reasoning in mind. So start where the author starts. So quite literally, how does Marge Simpson begin her letter to Barbara Bush? And that's where you're going to begin your body paragraph. So you got to argue, use your terms and devices. Always, 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 no matter the expository mode, no matter the genre, the first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. All right, and this gives students space to multitask the first premise, to have a few terms and devices that they're going to intermingle and intertwine. And this adds to the complexity of the read. Because otherwise, if you think about it, to do a full read, you would need 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph ethos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can't do that. You're going to run out of time, and it's just not a skillful way to write an essay, to do a rhetorical analysis. So it's really important that students begin to see how the pieces jigsaw fit each other. So let's look at these 3 sentences. It's going to establish a chronology and a sequence with this transition right out of the gate. Right from the onset, Marge lets the First Lady know that she's dealing with someone who's dignified and can hold her own in high society. So I'm going to talk about the formality of the letter. Positioning herself like a woman accustomed to the formalities of proper letter writing, Marge takes all the necessary steps to indicate that Mrs. Bush's remarks were in fact out of line. Matching wit for wit, Marge lets the First Lady know that she errantly miscategorized her family. So I'm setting up the sarcasm there. I'm setting up the ethos. So we have form ethos, and sarcasm. So that's what I mean by multitasking. Now, if I am to keep my line of reasoning, I have to keep the promise of the first premise. I have to talk about those three things. If anything extraneous comes in here, I'm probably going to have a logical fallacy or break my line of reasoning. So all my quotes and all my paraphrases need to be germane to these three terms and devices. Otherwise, it's probably going to fall apart. So let's see how I do. Immediately, and let me back up here. In the fourth sentence, we introduce the second premise. And I tell my students, you probably want to get quoting, like in the fourth sentence. But since I'm talking about form and template, it's kind of hard to quote. So I got to paraphrase that and hold off on my quotes a little bit. So this is a slightly untraditional and unconventional from my typical template moves, but see how it rolls. Immediately, Marge demonstrates that she's couth enough to know the formal template of how to address a person of high standing. Beginning with the date and then proceeding to the address and proper salutation, Marge asserts her own ethos in terms of debunking the claims that her and her family are the dumbest thing that the First Lady's ever seen. So you got to get quoting. Teeter-totter balance the quote and the paraphrasing. So I got that, all right? And everything's connected, so I'm keeping my promise. Adapting this dainty persona allows for Marge to counter the initial remarks by drawing into question just how qualified Mrs. Bush is in making such assumptions. So I'm getting into the ethos. Opening the letter with short, simple declarative sentences, Marge lets the president's wife know that she was deeply hurt. So again, chronologically, just proceed sequentially, chronologically through the passage, through the letter. Saying it so succinctly adds to the gravity and sincerity of the emotion. But the tone quickly shifts when Marge cites Dr. Seuss as stating that a person is a person. So quote, paraphrase, analyze, all weave it together. Teeter-totter balance that out. So you can see here I'm drawing from the text pretty sufficiently, pretty amply, and I got three terms here, three devices that I'm arguing, so I need to draw from the text a few times. Marge is pointing out the irony of the situation. The First Lady is objecting to a cartoon program. Next, Marge creates a stark dichotomy between her own moral code to that of the most prominent lady in the country. And again, just note some of the things that are going on here. Keep it in tier 2 level vocabulary land. Focus on those sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow. So all of that stays static. And quote, it's a 1, 2, 3 punch. Quote, analyze, paraphrase. Teaching her children not to talk badly about people, even if they're rich, Marge positions herself as having greater decency than someone who suggests that another family is the dumbest thing she's ever seen. But as a means to counter these remarks, Marge sarcastically asked the First Lady to consider if Washington must be a good deal different than the Simpsons family unit. So I got plenty of support and analysis. And one of the things I do as a reader is I always go back and I say, did you keep the promise of the first premise? Are all your quotes, all your paraphrasings germane to the terms and devices that you dropped up here? And I would say, yes, indeed. And you even can go outside a little bit. So I talked briefly about these short, simple declarative sentences, but it all ties in. And I didn't go on and on and on about it. It's just one sentence. You know, you got to cover syntax, the syntactical features in the piece. So check a box, covered. So in the end, you just have to really echo the thesis, make your links back, and keep the promise of the first premise. Marge, the First Lady of a slovenly and simple man, is not afraid to go mano a mano with a lady who needs to be brought down a few pegs. Slightly flippant and irreverent, Marge delivers an obvious message. A First Lady should not be so entrenched in such trivial matters, especially when her own flaws are so apparent. Again, take 10, 11, 12 sentences to do that. So the next question that teachers and students ask is, what do I do next? And the answer is bust out another syllogism. You still have a ton of stuff left to analyze. You've gone chronologically, and I'm only, probably at around the middle of the letter. I still have the entire rest of the letter to analyze. But one of the things you can see in this is that you cross-analyze when needed. So you don't have to go strictly lockstep through the letter. If something ties up in links, then go cross-analyze that. Bounce around a little bit. It's not that rigid. So that's how we roll. So that's Marge Simpson to Barbara Bush. So just to wrap up here, give you a couple updates on what's going on in my world if you want to follow me a little further. So I am working with Perfection Learning, and we should be doing a monthly free webinar. I got off track because I was sick there for a while, but we'll get going on that again. And soon I'm going to do one on my alternative grading methods. So if you're sick and tired of giving up your weekends and evenings to traditional grading practices that don't work, then tune in and learn a whole brand new paradigm for grading that will liberate you. I also have an iron in the fire with the National Writing Project. We'll be doing some work together in the coming weeks, and I'll keep the Facebook groups notified of that. And then probably my biggest iron in the fire is that I'm collaborating on a textbook with Tim Freitas, that awesome guy from Garden of English fame. And we're just plugging away at that textbook slowly but surely. And I'm in the research gathering phase of constructing my portion. And ultimately what I want to do is equip teachers with my templates, my alternative grading methods, and my alternative discussion modalities, and have them report back to me and just say, hey, Christian, this is how it's going. This is what I'm seeing. And use that anecdotal information in my textbook. So to gather that information, I've created something that I'm calling the Teach It Right 5-Week Mastermind. So I'm taking about 5 teachers over a 5-week period. We meet Sundays, 5 consecutive Sundays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for an hour, followed by Q&A. And each week, I just equip you with a little more of my tricks of the trade. You take them into the classroom. I overlook your shoulder. The 5 or 6 of us collaborate together and assist and help each other out. We make a ton of lesson plans and units together, which is really helpful and cool. And then it's just a reporting. So if you're interested in joining us for that, and if you want more information, feel free to drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And I do have some information on my webpage about it as well. And that webpage address is www.teachinghowtowrite.com. So, all right, hopefully you found this to be useful. It's kind of a lighthearted piece to break some of the gravity of rhetorical analysis. So sometimes that can get heavy and a little burdensome doing pedantic text all the time. So anyways, be well, happy teaching, and happy writing.